They were the most notorious royal family and dynasty to ever rule over England, the Tudors, and they are best remembered for taking the heads off their enemies, the crazy relationship and 6 wives of King Henry VIII, and the skill of Elizabeth I's rule. The Tudors were never meant to become kings and rulers. It was luck of King Henry VII defeating King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field that ended the Wars of the Roses. It brought the Tudors the crown through the right of conquest. Yes, they had royal blood, but this wasn't a huge link to the kings and queens of the past. But in the centuries following their deaths, the Tudor kings and queens have had their coffins and remains broken into, and some have even taken things from the bodies of the monarchs who ruled around 500 years ago. In this video, we delve into what was found when the royal coffins of the Tudors were opened. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the most influential and notorious royal families in history was the Tudors, and their kings and queens would change the face of England forever. Henry VIII was known for his brutality, and he would have 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed inside the walls of the Tower of London. But Henry was never meant to have been king. It was his father, Henry VII, who founded the Tudor dynasty and ended the Wars of the Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York. But Henry VII reigned for a period of around 24 years, and he brought a lot of stability to the throne. But he died at the age of 52, leaving England in the hands of his son, Henry VIII, who would bring the nation under a significant number of changes himself. But did you know that Henry VII's burial vault was opened a number of times throughout the years? Henry VII became the King of England by the right of conquest, and he then married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring factions of the Wars of the Roses and to bring an end to decades of disputes over the rightful king. Some saw Henry as a usurper who had dethroned the rightful King Richard, but he faced a number of rebellions in the years after that came in the form of pretenders, with these claiming they were the princes in the Tower, or Edward V, the boy king who had disappeared from sight inside the Tower of London. He managed to put them down and would show a ruthless side, as he had some of his enemies executed. This showed that Henry VII was someone not to be crossed. Henry was not someone who knew how to run a nation, and he had a number of close advisors who helped him do this. He was more prudent than other monarchs, and he made the crown very rich, through raising taxes and increasing the ruthlessness in which these were collected. But some people were not happy to pay this. Henry VII was a man who was very shrewd, and throughout his reign one of the major boom industries was wool and cloth inside of England, and this was then traded around the world. He also increased his stranglehold over law and order, introducing justices of peace to make sure the nation's laws were being adhered to. Henry VII, despite having differing popularity, did manage to increase stability in the monarchy following the Civil War. But in 1502, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII's first son, Arthur, died. He was the heir to the throne and was very much the man expected to become the next Tudor king. He had died following his marriage to Catherine of Aragon inside of Ludlow Castle and passed away from the sweating sickness. This loss hurt the king greatly, and for a man who rarely showed any emotion in public, he was overwhelmed by grief. Henry VII would cry uncontrollably at court. However, further heartbreak came a year later as his wife, Elizabeth of York, died inside the Tower of London. She had just given birth, but days later both Elizabeth and the child died, and with this Henry VII was devastated and he shut himself away, and it was said he himself became very ill and almost died from this unknown illness. It was said the only woman who could bring him out of his upset was his mother, but following Elizabeth's death, he did consider remarrying. In February of 1508, it was noted that the king was suffering from gout, and it was also reported months later that he was in the last stages of consumption, Writers of the time noted how, in the final years of his life, that Henry VII had become sicker more often, and that things were getting more serious each time. It was also reported around this time that Henry VII was very ill and in extremis, and that he was very ill without hope of recovery. But the king managed to battle on as long as he could, and by the end of March 1509 he knew that death was on the horizon, and he drafted his last will and testament. The decline in the king's health was brought about by the fact he was grieving his wife and his son, and many of his close friends and loyal advisers also around this time became sick and ill. With this, Henry VII made sure there would be a seamless transition of power for his son Henry VIII to come onto the throne after his death. Accounts of the death of Henry VII mostly come from Bishop John Fisher. He stated that he said how 2 nights before the king's death he became so weak that he could not hear mass at the altar and had struggled for some time to eat and drink. However, he was keen to do his religious duty, and he summoned his confessor to his bedside to hear the sacrament. Mass at his bedside was heard. At Henry it was said to have been a very moving spectacle. It was said that those who witnessed Henry receiving the sacrament were moved with a marvellous compassion and flow of tears, that at some time they wept and sobbed by the space of 3/4 of an hour. On the day of his death he heard mass again, and this time held the crucifix a number of times with great reverence, embracing it tenderly and kissing it. He was in a significant amount of pain and was suffering and scared, and he in his final moments appealed to Jesus to deliver his soul and to protect him. It was said he claimed, "O my blessed Jesus, O my Lord, deliver my soul from the misery of this world, deliver my soul from these deadly pains, deliver my could from this corruptible body." In his final moments, the king's son, Prince Henry, who was just 17 at the time, was summoned to his father's bedside for his final instructions, and the king said, "Fatherly and godly exhortations committed unto him the laborious governance of this realm of England." However, the original plan was for Henry VII to be buried inside of Windsor, and work had begun on rebuilding part of the chapel as a tomb house, but this was never finished. However, the Lady Chapel inside of Westminster Abbey was being remodelled also, and this would become the resting place of Henry VII. His wife, Elizabeth of York, had been interred in a grave near the new Lady Chapel, but following Henry VII's death, the pair were then interred inside of a large burial vault in the heart of the chapel before the altar and opposite the tomb of Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. But Henry VII's tomb was actually placed in an eastern position in the chapel, presumably by Henry VIII, to then make way for his own burial. The tomb cost a huge sum of £1,500 and was made by Pietro Torrengiano of Florence. The monument has a black marble tomb chest and is ornamented with copper gilt, and also features the bronze effigies of the king and his queen. Henry VII and Elizabeth's coffins were buried here in a vault beneath the monument and tomb, and this vault is 2.7 metres long and 1.5 metres wide and high, and it is not the smallest. The lead coffins were covered with symbols such as Maltese crosses. However, the burial vault of Henry VII was broken into a number of times. The vault was opened first in 1603, and this was hugely significant, as the body of Elizabeth I and her coffin was placed inside the same vault. Because of the size of the vault, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's coffin may have had to have been moved to the side. Elizabeth I's burial inside the same vault was significant, as it was marking her as a very important Tudor monarch, and one of the greatest, and it was an honour for her in death. However, she would not be laid to rest for long, as when James I came onto the throne, he ordered her to be buried in a vault with her half-sister, Mary I. Elizabeth I's coffin was removed and reburied elsewhere in Westminster Abbey, and then following the death of James I, His body was then interred inside of Henry VII's burial vault himself. It's almost as if James had Elizabeth I moved for himself. To incorporate James I's coffin, the outer wooden shells of Henry VII's coffin and Elizabeth of York's were removed to make room, and this left the first Tudor king and queen inside of their lead cases. But also at this point, the visceral urns of Henry and Elizabeth may have been moved elsewhere. These were the boxes and urns that held the hearts and internal organs of the king and queen after their death, and they were removed during the embalming process. But again, the vault of Henry VII would be opened one more time in 1869 by the curious Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley. He was looking for the coffin of James I, and of course he found this alongside Henry VII, and he commented on the lead shrouded body of Henry VII. He also sketched what he saw, and it was rather disturbing of an image, with the three shrouded bodies lying inside the vault eerily. Henry VII is remembered for being a steady king who brought stability following the Wars of the Roses. He was a man who would not spend too much during his reign, and he lived within his means, but taxed his population harshly at times, making the crown very rich. He would be buried inside the heart of his new mausoleum, the Lady Chapel, and he hoped that this would become a Tudor mausoleum for centuries to come. Within a century of his death, the Tudor period came to an end, and it would be the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, who brought an end to the Tudor period. Henry VIII was born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII. He was handsome, educated and athletic. He became king in 1509 at the age of 17, following the death of his father. The early years of his reign were marked by optimism and vitality, and he was seen as the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, tall, charismatic and full of promise. Yet decades of personal turmoil, political conflict and physical injury took their toll. By his late 40s, Henry's health had begun to collapse. A jousting accident in January of 1536, during which his horse fell upon him, left him unconscious for 2 hours and caused a severe leg wound. That injury never healed properly. Chronic ulcers developed on his leg, festering and discharging pus for the rest of his life. Contemporary sources, including the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, wrote that the stench from Henry's sores were unbearable. This leg wound, combined with an increasingly sedentary lifestyle and gluttonous appetite, contributed to his rapid physical decline. Once a trim sportsman, Henry grew massively obese, and by the 1540s he reportedly measured over 50 inches around the waist, and required a mechanical hoist to lift him onto his horse or into bed. The Venetian ambassador noted that the king was scarcely able to walk and was as full of sores as a foul leper. Henry's declining health only intensified his paranoia and cruelty. His mood swings became legendary. Courtiers and even family members lived in fear of his temper. He executed 2 of his wives, Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Catherine Howard in 1542, and countless nobles and former allies, including his trusted minister, Thomas Cromwell. By the 1540s, the king's mind appeared clouded by bitterness and suspicion. He lashed out at both Protestants and Catholics, unsure whom to trust. His once keen intellect dulled under the strain of pain and illness. Chronic headaches, obesity, and leg ulcers may have been symptoms of type 2 diabetes or Cushing's syndrome. Some historians even suggest he suffered from McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that can cause mental deterioration. Despite this, Henry continued to rule absolutely. His courtiers indulged his whims, afraid to contradict him. He clung to a vision of power and divine right, convinced that he remained God's chosen ruler, but in private his world was shrinking. His last wife, Catherine Parr, nursed him devotedly, reading scripture and tending to his wounds, and by late 1546, however, the king's condition had become critical. He was morbidly obese, suffering from severe pain, chronic infection, and possibly kidney failure. His once thunderous voice was weak, his appetite, once legendary, diminished. The royal physicians tried to comfort him, but they could do little. Medicine in Tudor England was primitive, and Henry's distrust of doctors, whom he often dismissed or punished for failure, made matters worse. By January of 1547, the king was confined to his bed at Whitehall Palace. He could no longer walk, and his ulcerated leg had turned gangrenous. Those close to him feared that he was dying, but few dared to say it aloud. Under Tudor custom, it was treasonous to predict the king's death while he was still alive. Sir Anthony Denny, chief gentleman of the king's privy chamber, and one of the few men Henry still trusted, was eventually brave enough to break the news, and on the evening of the 27th of January, Denny told him that, in man's judgment, you are not like to live long. Henry responded with calm resignation. According to contemporary reports, he asked whether he should receive the sacrament. When Denny said yes, Henry replied that he placed his faith in God through the merits of Christ's passion. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was summoned to his bedside in the early hours of the 28th of January. By the time Cranmer arrived, Henry was unable to speak. The Archbishop asked him to give a sign that he trusted in Christ's mercy, and Henry squeezed his hand. Moments later, the King of England, once Europe's most feared monarch, was dead. The time was around 2 a.m, and he was 55 years old. Henry's death was kept secret for several days. The Tudor court was a dangerous place at the best of times, and the sudden death of a monarch could spark chaos. The Privy Council needed time to organise the succession. Henry's only legitimate son, Edward, was just 9 years old, and factions within the court were already vying for control. Henry had named a council of regency in his will, but Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, wasted no time consolidating power. He would soon become Lord Protector and rule as Duke of Somerset. To ensure a smooth transition, Henry's death was not publicly announced until the 31st of January, 3 whole days after it occurred. During this period, courtiers continued to deliver meals to the king's chambers to keep up the illusion that he was still alive. Henry's body was embalmed and placed in a lead-lined coffin, but even this process could not prevent the rapid decay of his enormous corpse. The king's remains were first taken to Sion Abbey for a night before the funeral procession then continued to Windsor. According to later accounts, a gruesome incident occurred while the coffin rested at Sion. It said the coffin leaked fluid through the lead, and dogs were found licking the blood that had seeped onto the floor. Chroniclers, such as Gilbert Burnet, later saw this as divine retribution for Henry's dissolution of the monasteries and his brutal treatment of the church. On the 16th of February 1547, the king was buried at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, in a vault beneath the choir. The coffin was placed next to that of Jane Seymour, his third wife, and, by his own admission, his true wife, who had died giving birth to his long-desired son, Edward. Henry had intended a grand tomb for himself, with gilded effigies and angels, but it was never completed. His mortal remains still lie in the same vault as Jane, marked only by a simple black marble slab placed there in the 19th century. Now, the burial vault inside of St George's Chapel was never meant to be a permanent resting place for the six-wifed king. Henry commissioned and planned for a huge monument to be created in his memory, and it would feature on top a huge amount of stone and an effigy presumably of he and Jane Seymour. His body, following the completion of this, would then be taken presumably to Westminster Abbey to be buried in a vault under the tomb. But his children never finished the construction of his tomb, and over the years Henry's coffin was just left inside of the vault. Now, when the vault was first opened, it was to bury the executed corpse of King Charles I, a century after Henry's death. Charles was the king who caused the English Civil War, and he was, at the time of his death, considered by most a tyrant. But he had many supporters, so Parliament, the king's enemy, decided to inter Charles quietly inside of Henry VIII's vault. Now, when the vault was opened, work needed to be done to allow Charles's coffin to be placed inside. Henry VIII's coffin, which was large, had shown signs of damage and cracking. There were reports that an explosion of gases from within the coffin had caused damage to his body. However, it was noted that Henry's coffin was damaged. It was alleged that even his face could be seen, and those who entered the vault would claim they could see the king's beard on his face within the coffin. The vault itself contained today 3 coffins, one of Henry, another belonging to Jane Seymour, his third wife, and then King Charles I. The trestle that Henry's coffin sat on was damaged when the coffin was moved to the side for Charles, but it's also important to note that another burial was carried out when an infant child of Queen Anne was interred. The burial vault is very small and hardly contains enough room for the 3 remains. It was opened another time by a foot soldier who worked inside of Windsor, and this man allegedly stole a bone of Henry VIII by drilling a hole into the coffin, and he then wanted to craft a knife handle using the bone of the infamous Tudor king. But this was discovered, and the bone was then returned, and by the last time the vault was then opened, Henry's remains had decayed to a complete skeleton, as the damage to the coffin had led to his embalmed remains to become just bones. So, under the choir inside of St. George's Chapel, thousands of people each week walk past a small black marble slab that tells that 2 of England's most infamous and notorious kings are laid to rest beneath their feet inside the burial vault. The bodies of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, Charles I, and a small child rest, and it's not believed that the bodies have been disturbed in over a century. Following the death of King Henry VIII, the son he greatly wished for took over as the King of England, succeeding his brutal and tyrannical father. But the plan was for Edward VI to reign for a long time, and for his son's children to then continue the Tudor dynasty for centuries. But this never happened, as at the age of 15 inside of Greenwich Palace, the ill King of England succumbed to a terrible death, and he was for his last few months suffering. Edward VI was buried following his death inside of Westminster Abbey, but his resting place for a long time was lost. However, in the centuries after, his coffin was located and his coffin was even opened, and what those curious people found when they opened the casket was shocking. When Edward VI was just 9, his father, Henry VIII, died and was then crowned king inside of Westminster Abbey. A regency council was established to help him rule, and at the top of this was Edward Seymour, his uncle, the Lord Protector. However, in 1550, Edward VI was stricken with a mysterious illness which was very serious, and the royal doctors and physicians believed that this was possible, that Edward could have died, and because of this they were worried who would become king or queen next if Edward, the young boy, did die. However, Edward VI did recover from this, and this bout of ill health was kept a secret. But in the years following, the boy king did suffer another illness which was deadly. He would before this catch measles and also smallpox, but he did manage to recover again, showing that he was strong and was not always sickly and could demonstrate strength. But the king was at this time a little deaf and also wore glasses. However, in the December of 1552, things took a turn for the worse. Edward VI began to show signs of tuberculosis and measles, and the measles had caused the problems with his immune system. On the 15th of February 1553, it was said that the king was sick with a feverish cold, and Mary, his eldest sister, came to visit him. However, he was during this meeting bedridden, and he was displaying a very violent cough. Some rumours dominated the royal household that he had been poisoned, but to many the king's health remained a secret. He had a number of different symptoms, which were all very serious, and the best doctors and physicians across England were brought in to treat him. One woman, who it's believed was almost like a faith healer, was let into the king's apartments, and she administered a potion that almost killed the king and caused his limbs to swell up. However, on the 17th of March 1553, things continued to take a turn for the worst. Edward VI, the son of King Henry VIII, was now a thin and weak young boy who was very gaunt, and the doctors recorded that he was approaching his death. In the April of 1553, his health did pick up slightly as he was spotted walking in a local park, and he was then sent to Greenwich Palace to recover. But it was here where he would die. Edward was seen in the gardens growing weaker, but he was coughing up blood, and some doctors still believed he would recover. But there was a belief that there was a tumour in his lungs causing his high fever, but his stomach was very swollen, and he also broke out in sores and ulcers. On the 17th of May 1553, he met with European ambassadors, and he was very weak during this, but his body continued to swell, as did his head and legs, and he was given tablets to help him sleep. However, then, adaptations were made to the line of succession, and the throne was then to be given to Edward's cousin, Lady Jane Grey. In mid-June, he was not eating, and doctors predicted that he had a matter of days left to live. The king's last few days were horrific, as he could only lay on his back and his hair was falling out. On the 1st of July, he was spotted by a crowd at a window, but on the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI, at around 8 in the evening, died in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. He said his final words, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." The doctors then, following his death, opened up his chest, and they found out that the king's lungs were infected, and he had 2 ulcers on them. Edward VI's body was embalmed and then sealed in a lead coffin for burial, and he was then to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, officiated the service, and the funeral procession was similar to King Henry VIII's. Edward's body was taken by barge to Whitehall, and the night before the funeral he was taken to Westminster Abbey, along with a large procession, and it was a huge event of pageantry. Many people cried and were upset when they saw the king's coffin, and once his body was taken into the abbey, it was surrounded by burning candles. The funeral service was performed, and Edward VI's body was lowered into a white marble vault in front of an altar, which had been made by Pietro Torrigiano for his grandfather, Henry VII. There were plans considered for Edward VI's funeral, and there was a debate as to place Edward VI inside of a tomb, close to where his father Henry VIII had been buried in St George's Chapel in Windsor, but the tomb was never finished or worked on. Edward VI's burial vault itself was very small, measuring 2.3 metres long and 75 centimetres wide, and this was close to the entrance of a much larger vault of his grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty. There were later talks, even later on, to bury Edward VI alongside his half-sister Mary I in the same tomb, but as mentioned, nothing would ever be made for the boy king. However, during the English Civil War of the 17th century, the altar marking where Edward VI was buried was destroyed by Puritans in 1643, and it's believed that the burial vault of Edward may have also at this time been disturbed or broken into. This was common at the time for many royal burials, as Puritans and other parliamentarians ransacked tombs and burials of those who were a symbol of the monarchy. But centuries later, in 1868, fragments of the altar were found, and a new one was then built marking where Edward VI was buried. However, the burial vault of Edward VI was then opened, and the Tudor king's coffin was found. It was said in 1868, when the royal vault was opened, that Edward VI's outer coffin, the wooden shell that had been partly cleared away, and it was damaged, meaning that someone had previously been in and had done this to the vault. It could have been the Puritans. However, there had been some damage to Edward's coffin and also some effort to even possibly break into his tomb. It was also said that the lead coffin of the boy Tudor king had deformed as well as wasted by long corrosion. Because of this, it meant that Edward VI's remains were on display and could be seen through the coffin, and there were no repairs done to give the Tudor king a new coffin. It was said The cerecloth had fallen away and showed that no hair was attached to the skull. This meant that Edward VI's remains had decayed and that his remains were now skeletal, and the cerecloth had not done its job to preserve the remains as best as they could, and this may have been caused by the damage to the coffin. Edward VI's coffin had been damaged by someone, or something such as internal gases building up and exploding inside of the coffin. However, the more probable possibility is that it was broken into and damaged when the Puritans attacked the altar next to his remains. But today there is no tomb for Edward VI, marking his small burial vault, except a small memorial stone that states, "In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. This stone was placed here by the Christ's Hospital in thanksgiving for their founder, the 7th of October, 1966. Edward VI was the great hope for the Tudor dynasty, and he was the son that Henry VIII greatly wished for and wanted. However, his life was tinged with sadness and tragedy. As his teenage years, he died a very painful death, and his demise was horrific and brutal. But the mysterious damage to Edward's coffin inside of the burial vault was never repaired, and there were no efforts to sort this out, meaning that today Edward VI's skull may still be sitting inside of a damaged coffin. One of the most shocking and notorious queens ever to have ruled over England was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, who was known as Bloody Mary. She was the queen who burned over 200 people at the stake for their differing religious beliefs, and Mary's short but brief reign was one which was very turbulent. She would reverse the huge religious changes her brother Edward VI and father made, and this led people to be rather confused, and they did not know where they stood. But Mary's reign was not long, and many believed she would never be a ruling queen. However, Mary suffered with a lot of severe health problems in her life, and these eventually contributed to her death. Mary I died at the age of 42 inside of St James's Palace, and Mary was then buried inside of a burial vault in Westminster Abbey, close to where her grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, were buried. But the burial vault of Mary I was disturbed a number of times, and shockingly, when it was last opened, what those people found was shocking. Mary I, despite being the ruthless monarch who burned many people at the stake, was a woman who suffered a great deal with her health and well-being. She was a young woman who had many problems that led to the royal doctors and physicians considering that she would not live very long, and the physicians believed she would die before she would ever become queen or be considered to have been a martyr. She was living in the 16th century, a time where there were huge disease outbreaks plaguing England. Mary suffered with a number of serious swellings in her stomach when she became queen, and she believed she was pregnant, but no child ever came. And today it's considered that she suffered from ovarian or uterine cancer. But in 1558, Mary I made preparations for her death, and she claimed that she wanted Philip II to act as the regent if she ever had a child, but this would not be popular, as Philip was hated. There were never any children ever born to Mary I, and with this she then had to consider who her successor would be, and she turned to her great rival, Elizabeth, her half-sister, who would go on to become Queen Elizabeth I. In 1558, there was a huge amount of influenza and flu, which was causing chaos across England, and it was killing people at the rate of which the Black Death was. The flu lingered on, and it would claim its victims over time. But Mary tried to avoid the disease, but in the summer of 1558, she was suffering with depression and a huge lack of sleep. It was said in August that Mary had dropsy, and she had a fever which was low, and because of this she was considered on death's door. Because of this, Mary moved from Hampton Court Palace to St James's Palace, and she did have a high fever, bouts of dizziness and confusion, and also severe headaches. Mary also went blind, and she did recover a bit. However, with her growing depression and severe fever, she continued to go downhill. In the October of 1558, many of Mary's advisers had to make a decision, And the Privy Council then convinced the Queen to make her will, and they considered their own positions, and many began to schmooze Elizabeth in preparation for Mary's death, and they wanted a role inside of her new government. But in her final days, Mary did name Elizabeth her successor, and she went blind as her servants began to pray for her soul. She had bizarre dreams, and in the morning of the 17th of November 1558, she had a final mass said for her, and at around 4 a.m. she died peacefully. The servants believed she had fallen asleep, but she died, and the doctors confirmed her death. The funeral service was then planned, and it was to take place at Westminster Abbey. Mary I's reign over England was very short, but she made history, being the first queen to reign in her own right after being crowned during a coronation. And she was interred inside of Westminster Abbey. Her body was taken to Westminster in a large procession. On top of the coffin was a lifelike effigy of Mary, which was wearing coronation robes, and it had her orb and sceptre on the coffin also. It was Mary's show of royal power and importance even in her death, and despite the fact she was a very unpopular monarch, the funeral procession then made its way into Westminster Abbey. But Mary was then buried inside of the north side of Henry VII's Lady Chapel. There, today, is little that marks the reign or life of Mary I in her death and demise. There's no funeral effigy or tomb. There isn't a grand memorial either, just a small stone that says that Mary I was buried there. But in the 19th century, the tomb of Mary I was broken into and opened. However, one thing to consider is that this was not the first time it was broken into. Elizabeth I, following her death, was initially buried inside of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's tomb, but James I, her successor, then ordered the exhumation of Elizabeth so that she could be buried in the same vault as Mary. Because of this, Mary's coffin was moved, and actually, in an act of disgrace against the former Catholic Queen, Elizabeth I's coffin was placed directly on top of Mary's to signal that Elizabeth was much more important than Mary. But in 1880, Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, encountered the burial vault of Mary I, and he wrote an account on what he saw. He found the coffins of Mary and Elizabeth, and he recorded what he saw, and he said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a long, narrow vanlet immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was a Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover, on each side the august initial E.R. and below the memorial date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow modelling panelling, and the coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid contained the inscription, and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak covers, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been hereto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. But still today, the death and life of Mary I is not the most celebrated inside of Westminster Abbey, and Elizabeth I's tomb, which sits above Mary's body, is grand and ornate. Mary I was never given her own burial vault, unlike many other kings and queens buried inside of Westminster. Her vault is not filled with the coffins of others, and still today it's believed only her and Elizabeth's coffin lay in the vault. One of the most iconic yet greatest queens ever to rule over England was the final Tudor monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. She, during her decades in power, oversaw a huge time of change in which there was a huge boom in culture. Writers such as Shakespeare were making a name for themselves, and Elizabeth would also manage to see off a number of threats to her throne. A lot of people across England did not want the Protestant Elizabeth as their queen, and they preferred to turn to Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic former Queen of Scotland, to rule. Because of this, Mary was embroiled in a number of plots against the life of Elizabeth, and the Tudor Queen dealt with this once and for all by ordering her execution. As Mary, Queen of Scots' head was taken clean off by axe, but she also defeated the Spanish Armada, the most feared and notorious fleet and army of the time. But Elizabeth was a queen greatly beloved by her people, and many could not imagine a world in which she did not rule over them. But as the year 1603 came, Elizabeth I was not as glorious as she once was, and she was a woman who was giving up on her life, and she was coming to terms with her own demise and death. However, she would be buried in a huge tomb eventually. But this was broken into, and what those who did this found was shocking, strange, and incredible. In the early morning of the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died. She was, by the standards of the Tudor period, a very elderly lady, and she had lived and ruled for many decades. But she was then succeeded by the Scottish King James, who was invited to come and dual rule England and Scotland, meaning the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart dynasty. This would have greatly upset her father, Henry VIII, who at one point even barred the Stuarts from the throne. But Elizabeth had been ill for many months, and her health was getting worse, and many people around her were beginning to believe that the end of her life was near. She was a woman who had survived many of the deadliest diseases of the 16th century, and she was afflicted, for example, with smallpox, and her face still bore the scars of the brutal disease. But in her final days, Elizabeth I was depressed, and often for long periods of time rather vacant, and she seemed long in thought. It's believed she was contemplating many of the decisions she had took as Queen of England, including ordering the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, another anointed queen, and she was concerned that this would prevent her from one day getting into heaven. She was concerned about what was next, and the Queen was almost 70 when she did eventually die. In her final days, she was accompanied and waited on by her servants and closest friends, as well as when she took to the deathbed the Archbishop of Canterbury. He promised Elizabeth not to worry, and she would go to heaven, and that she would rule one day again as a queen in heaven. She was also told her close friends had died, would be waiting for her, and that she should remain close to God in her final moments. But her final moments were hard, and her throat swelled up, and speaking was a problem. But the Queen then gave up her fight against the illness that proved to cause her death. Inside of her private bedchambers within Richmond Palace, Queen Elizabeth I died, and she gave a number of instructions as to what should happen next following her death. It's well known that Elizabeth did not like the thought of being disemboweled and having her internal organs removed and then buried away from her body. But this was tradition for monarchs of the time, and despite Elizabeth saying she did not want this to happen, doctors and physicians ignored the request. Elizabeth's body was cut open, and her heart, along with other organs, were removed, and then her cavity was stuffed with spices to stave off decay. This eventually was a good thing to have happened, as during the funeral procession, the movement of the coffin on the procession may have caused the body of Elizabeth to explode, as violent gases emerged out of her body and even splintered the coffin. This subsequent posthumous explosion would have been worse without the embalming process. But Elizabeth was, following her death, left inside of a lead-lined coffin which was decorated with many Tudor images, including roses inside of Richmond Palace, before the procession to Westminster Abbey began. This was a journey which had a number of steps. The coffin of Elizabeth was taken down the River Thames on the royal barge to the Palace of Whitehall. Her coffin had been draped in black velvet, and it was kept a close watch on by 6 of Elizabeth's ladies. It was said that during the procession on the River Thames that the oars at every stroke did tears left fall, and the people of London were gutted about losing their queen. But the queen's body had been wrapped tightly in the coffin in cerecloth when the alleged explosion took place, but her remains, regardless, continued to Westminster Abbey, and on the 28th of April 1603, the funeral procession occurred to Westminster Abbey. It was said by onlookers that the city of Westminster was surcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequy. There was as such a general sighing, groaning and weeping, as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. The coffin of Elizabeth I was decorated with a large effigy of her on the top, which was dressed in her Parliament robes, and on top of the effigy was the crown of the Queen. Her hands held the sceptres of power, and the effigy was made from wax and also wood. But this was one of the first times that the people of London had seen their Queen and what she looked like, as portraits were not readily available to the poorer people. The coffin was pulled by 4 horses, and when it arrived at Westminster Abbey, yeomen of the guard carried it into the church for the funeral service. The funeral of Elizabeth I was conducted by the Dean of Westminster, Dean Andrews, and after the funeral service, the coffin was carried into the Henry VII Lady Chapel. Her body was lowered into the same vault as Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, her grandparents, at the heart of the Tudor mausoleum, showing the respect that the people of England had for their queen. This was a huge honour, and was seen as a fitting tribute. However, in 1607, a number of years after her death, the body of Elizabeth I was moved, and her coffin was brought back onto the surface of the earth. James I, her successor, ordered that Elizabeth's coffin should be moved to be placed under a tomb which had been crafted showing her, but he also said that she should be buried in this new vault with her sister's coffin, sitting directly below her, symbolising how Elizabeth was much more significant in her reign to Mary I, who was also known as Bloody Mary. The tomb of Elizabeth was huge and large, and she was laid to rest in a room opposite Mary Queen of Scots, James I's mother, and 46 shillings and 4 pence was paid for the removal of Elizabeth's body and the subsequent reburial. The tomb today is still spectacular, and Mary still today is buried underneath her half-sister. But in the 1800s, the burial vault of Elizabeth was broken into by curious members of Westminster Abbey. In 1880, a book was published by the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, who had been given special permission by Queen Victoria to explore the vaults and burial vaults of Westminster Abbey in order to create an inventory as to what was actually inside. He was looking in particular for the coffin of King James I, and he discovered this in the original burial site of Elizabeth I, in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But then Stanley was exploring other rooms off the royal vault, and he explored an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I, and he found a small opening in the walls. He crept through this and then entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I, and he noticed the 2 coffins which were in this. There were no other coffins, and the sanctity of the Tudor Queen's remains had been respected for centuries. Arthur Stanley wrote what he saw when he broke into the burial vault of Elizabeth I. The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a low, narrow van lit immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger and far more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side the august initial E.R., and below the memorial date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with a narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak 1/2 inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had been covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted space which had been hitherto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. This was the last time that the burial vault of Elizabeth I was opened, and this is the clearest account as to what it looks like to this day. There may be other times in which the burial vault was opened, however this is not known about, and still today the remarkable tomb of Elizabeth I marks the very site where just underneath the floor the brilliant final Tudor queen lays to rest.